The chill morning wind carrying dust across the parched plains of Emerson Creek did nothing to ease the pain in Darius Summers's side as he stumbled toward the small frontier town, one hand pressed against the blood-stained tear in his shirt. 28 years of hard living had taught him one immutable truth in this merciless world. A man survived by trusting no one but himself and his Colt revolver. The year was 1878, and the promise of America's Western territories had lured countless dreamers, desperados, and the desperate alike. Darius belonged firmly to the second category, at least according to the wanted poster, with his likeness that was likely hanging in the sheriff's office of the very town he now approached. He wasn't a killer, despite what the posters claimed. The shooting in Cottonwood Springs had been self-defense, plain and simple. The mining company foreman had drawn first after Darius confronted him about shorting the workers' pay. But the foreman's brother was the county judge, and suddenly Darius found himself with a $500 bounty on his head and a bullet in his side from a trigger-happy bounty hunter who'd ambushed him 2 days prior. Darius had managed to escape, but the wound was festering. Without help, he'd be dead in days. Yet help meant revealing himself, and revealing himself meant risking the noose. Such was the cruel arithmetic of survival in the West. The main street of Emerson Creek appeared before him, a dusty thoroughfare lined with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a small church, and various other establishments typical of a frontier settlement. Few people milled about in the early morning light, a blessing, as Darius didn't have the strength to avoid too many curious eyes. He stumbled behind the general store, collapsing against its rear wall. His vision swam, darkness creeping at its edges. This might be where his trail ended after all. "Sir? Are you hurt?" The voice jolted him to alertness. Darius's hand instinctively moved toward his holster, but the simple act sent pain lancing through his side. A woman stood several paces away, her brown hair pulled back beneath a modest bonnet, her plain dress covered by an apron dusted with flour. She carried a basket covered with a cloth. "Get away," Darius growled, though the threat in his voice was undermined by its weakness. Instead of retreating, she stepped closer. "You're bleeding." "I'm fine. Just move along, madam." She set her basket down and approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "I work at the bakery. I was just bringing some day-old bread to leave behind the store for anyone who might need it." Darius tried to push himself to his feet and failed. "I don't need your charity." The woman's expression didn't change. She didn't ask his name or why he was bleeding behind a general store. She simply reached into her basket, pulled out a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and held it out. "It's not charity. It's bread. You look like you could use it." Their eyes met, and something in her steady gaze, absent of both pity and judgment, made Darius hesitate. In all his years of running, of fighting, of surviving by any means necessary, he'd grown accustomed to seeing fear or disgust in others' eyes. This woman's eyes held neither. After a moment, he reached out and took the bread. "Thank you," he muttered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You're welcome," she replied. Then, after a pause, "That wound needs tending." "I'll manage." "You'll die," she corrected with such matter-of-fact certainty that Darius found himself without a retort. "My father was a doctor back east. I know infection when I see it." Darius studied her face. She appeared to be in her mid-20s, with freckles scattered across her nose and cheeks. Her eyes, he noticed, were a striking hazel that seemed to shift between green and brown in the morning light. "Why would you help a stranger?" he finally asked. She smiled slightly. "I don't need to know your name to see you're in trouble. And I was raised to believe that helping those in trouble is simply what one does." She extended her hand. "I'm Willow Calloway." Darius hesitated, then took her hand. "Darius. Just Darius?" "For now." Willow nodded, accepting this. Can you walk? Just Darius? My home isn't far. Every instinct honed through years on the run told Darius to decline, to get back on his horse and ride on. But the blood seeping through his shirt and the throbbing pain told a different story. If he rode now, he'd likely fall from his horse before reaching the next town. I can walk, he said, though he wasn't entirely convinced of this fact. With Willow's help, Darius struggled to his feet. She was stronger than her slender frame suggested, bearing his weight as they moved slowly through the back alleys of Emerson Creek, avoiding the main thoroughfare. Willow's home was a small cottage at the edge of town, with a vegetable garden out front and a chicken coop to the side. Inside was modest but neat, with handmade curtains and a braided rug before the hearth. Sit here, she instructed, helping him to a chair at her kitchen table. She moved efficiently around the small space, gathering supplies, clean cloths, a basin of water, a bottle of whiskey, and a sewing kit. This is going to hurt, she warned, cutting away his shirt to reveal the angry, inflamed wound. I'm familiar with pain, Darius replied grimly. Drink, she said, handing him the whiskey bottle. He took several long swallows before she began cleaning the wound. Despite his claims of familiarity with pain, Darius couldn't suppress a groan when she poured whiskey directly onto the bullet hole. The bullet went clean through, which is fortunate, Willow commented, working with clinical precision. Though you've lost a lot of blood, and there's infection starting. Your bedside manner could use work, Darius managed through gritted teeth. To his surprise, she laughed a warm, genuine sound. My father always said the same thing. Said I was too honest with patients. Her expression grew more serious as she threaded a needle. This needs stitching. Ready? Darius took another swig of whiskey and nodded. Her hands were steady as she sewed the wound closed, front and back. Darius focused on her face to distract himself from the pain, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she occasionally bit her lower lip, the stray strand of hair that had escaped her bonnet to curl against her cheek. Why are you really helping me? He asked when she had finished bandaging his side. Willow sat back, wiping her hands on a cloth. I told you. People don't just help strangers out of the goodness of their hearts. Not in my experience. Then you've met the wrong people, she replied simply. She stood and moved to a small stove where she began preparing a broth. You should rest. I've made up the spare bed in the back room. I can't stay, Darius protested, though his body betrayed him as he swayed in his chair. You can and you will, unless you're eager to undo all my fine stitching work and die of fever in a ditch somewhere. Her tone brooked no argument. Whatever trouble you're running from won't find you here tonight. Too weak to argue further, Darius allowed her to help him to a small bedroom off the main living area. The bed was narrow but clean, with fresh-smelling sheets. As soon as his head touched the pillow, exhaustion overwhelmed him, and he fell into a deep, troubled sleep. He dreamed of gunshots and galloping horses, of wanted posters and hanging ropes, and strangely, of warm bread offered without question. When Darius awoke, sunlight was streaming through the window. For a moment, he didn't recognize his surroundings, his hand automatically reaching for his gun before the events of the previous day came rushing back. The bakery woman, Willow, the bread, her unexpected kindness. His side ached, but the fiery pain had subsided to a dull throb. He cautiously sat up, finding that someone Willow presumably had removed his boots and gun belt, but left them within reach. A clean shirt was folded at the foot of the bed. The smell of coffee and cooking food drifted through the door. Darius pulled on the shirt a simple flannel that must have belonged to her father, or perhaps a brother, and made his way to the main room. Willow stood at the stove, her back to him, humming softly as she cooked. The domesticity of the scene struck Darius as utterly foreign. It had been years since he'd woken to anything other than a rented room or the open sky. Good morning, Willow said, turning as if sensing his presence. How's the wound? Better? Darius admitted, easing himself into a chair. Thank you. She nodded, setting a plate of eggs and bacon before him, along with a cup of coffee. You slept through yesterday afternoon and the whole night. Your body needed the rest. I should be moving on, Darius said, though he made no move to stand. The infection's still there. You need at least a few days' rest before traveling. She sat across from him with her own plate. Besides, you haven't told me your story yet. Darius raised an eyebrow. My story? Everyone has one, especially mysterious, wounded men who hide behind general stores. It's not a story worth telling. Darius took a bite of the eggs, surprised by how hungry he was. And knowing it would only bring you trouble. I'm rather capable of deciding what trouble I can handle, Willow replied evenly. She studied him for a moment, then changed the subject. I need to open the bakery soon. Will you be all right here alone? There's more food and books on that shelf if you get bored. Darius nodded. I'll be fine. After Willow left, Darius explored the small cottage, partly out of curiosity and partly from the ingrained caution of a man accustomed to knowing all escape routes. There were 2 bedrooms, the one he'd occupied, and a slightly larger one that was clearly Willow's. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor combined. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books, medical texts, novels, and poetry collections. On the mantelpiece were a few photographs, a serious-looking older man who must have been her father, and a woman with Willow's same hazel eyes. There was also a tintype of a younger Willow alongside a man in a Union Army uniform. A brother, perhaps, or a fiancé who never returned from the war. Nothing in the modest home suggested wealth or anything worth stealing, which made Willow's generosity all the more puzzling to Darius. People with little were usually the most protective of what they had, in his experience. As promised, there were books to pass the time. Darius selected a volume of Whitman's poetry, surprised to find such a controversial author in the home of a respectable-seeming bakery woman. He settled into a chair by the window, where he could keep an eye on the approach to the cottage while reading. The day passed quietly. Darius dozed intermittently, still weak from blood loss. He changed his bandages using supplies Willow had left out, noting with relief that the angry redness around the wound seemed to be receding. Willow returned in the late afternoon, carrying a basket filled with bread and pastries. The day's leftovers, she explained, setting the basket on the table. One benefit of running a bakery, there's always something to eat. Do you run it alone? Darius asked. I have a girl who helps in the mornings, the blacksmith's daughter, learning the trade. But yes, it's my bakery. There was a note of pride in her voice. How does a doctor's daughter from back east end up running a bakery in a frontier town? Willow smiled. So you do know how to ask questions. I was beginning to wonder. She hung her apron on a peg and sat in the chair opposite him. My father died during the war typhoid fever in a field hospital. My mother followed a few years later. I had an aunt in Denver who offered me a home, but... She shrugged. I wanted something that was mine. I'd always loved baking, and frontier towns always need bread. So here I am. And you're here alone? No husband? A shadow crossed her face. There was someone once. He was in my father's regiment. We wrote letters throughout the war, planned to marry when he returned. She glanced at the tintype on the mantelpiece. He made it through Gettysburg only to die at Cold Harbor. I'm sorry, Darius said, and found he meant it. It was a long time ago, Willow replied. And what about you? Where's your family? Darius hesitated, then decided a partial truth was safe enough. Don't have any. Mother died when I was young. Father was a drunk who took off when I was 14. I've been on my own since then. Doing what? This and that. Cattle drives. Mining. Whatever work was available. He deliberately omitted the less reputable jobs, the saloon fights for money, the occasional cattle rustling when times were especially lean. And now? Willow pressed gently. Darius met her gaze. Now I'm a man with a bullet wound being helped by a stranger who asks too many questions. To his surprise, she laughed. Fair enough, just Darius. She stood and moved to the stove. Hungry? Over the next 3 days, a routine developed. Willow would leave early for the bakery, returning midday to check on Darius and change his bandages. She'd go back for the afternoon rush, then return with more baked goods and stories about her customers. Darius found himself looking forward to these stories, the squabbling Henderson sisters who always bought competing pastries, the station master's young son who saved his pennies for a weekly sweet roll, the traveling salesman who tried to court Willow with exaggerated tales of his business success back east. For his part, Darius gradually shared more of himself, though he carefully avoided any details that might reveal his fugitive status. He told her about the beauty of Montana's mountains, the endless skies of Texas, the strange majesty of the desert at night. He described cattle drives and mining camps, the characters he'd encountered, the skills he'd learned. What surprised him most was how easily conversation flowed between them. Darius had spent so many years keeping to himself, speaking only when necessary, that he'd forgotten the simple pleasure of talking with someone who seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. On the fourth morning, Darius woke feeling stronger than he had in weeks. The wound was healing well, with no sign of the infection that had threatened his life. He made his way to the kitchen to find Willow already preparing breakfast. "You're moving better today," she observed, setting a plate of biscuits on the table. "Thanks to your care," Darius replied. "I should be able to ride out tomorrow." Something flickered across Willow's face. Disappointment, perhaps? Before she nodded. "Yes, I suppose you're well enough now." An awkward silence fell between them, the first since he'd arrived. "I can't thank you enough," Darius finally said. "Most people wouldn't have done what you did." "Most people haven't seen as much suffering as I have," Willow replied quietly. "My father taught me that helping others isn't exceptional, it's simply human." Darius considered this. "Your father sounds like a good man." "He was." Willow smiled sadly. "He would have liked you, I think. He always said you could tell a person's character by how they respond to kindness." "And how have I responded?" "With suspicion, initially," she said with a small laugh. "But then with grace. And gratitude." Their eyes met across the table, and Darius felt something shift between them, a recognition, an understanding that transcended the brief time they'd known each other. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Instinctively, Darius reached for the gun he no longer wore at his hip. "Stay here," Willow said, rising to answer. Through the partially open bedroom door, Darius heard a man's voice. "Morning, Miss Calloway. Sorry to disturb you so early." "That's quite all right, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" Darius tensed at the word sheriff, easing closer to the bedroom window. If necessary, he could be out and away before they even realized he'd gone. "Just wanted to warn you to keep your doors locked at night. There's word a fugitive might be in the area, fella named Summers, wanted for killing a mining foreman up north." "How frightening," Willow replied, her voice betraying no hint that the fugitive in question was mere feet away. "What does he look like?" "Tall, dark hair, probably unshaven. Posters say he's got a scar through his right eyebrow. Dangerous man shot the foreman in cold blood over a gambling debt, they say." Darius silently cursed. The scar was distinctive enough to identify him, but the story was a complete fabrication. There'd been no gambling, only his attempt to get the miners their fair pay. "I'll certainly be careful," Willow assured the sheriff. "Though I can't imagine such a man would come to a quiet town like ours." "Just being cautious, madam. There's a $500 reward for him, dead or alive, so there might be bounty hunters passing through too. Best stay clear of strangers for a while. I always do, Sheriff. Thank you for the warning. Darius heard the door close, followed by silence. A moment later, Willow appeared in the bedroom doorway, her expression unreadable. You heard? She asked. Yes. Darius met her gaze steadily. I should go before I bring trouble to your door. Is it true? What he said about the mining foreman? I shot him, Darius admitted. But not over a gambling debt. He was cheating miners out of their pay, working them in dangerous conditions. When I confronted him, he drew on me first. Willow studied his face, as if searching for the truth in his eyes. And you're certain he drew first? On my life. She seemed to come to a decision. Then you should stay until your wound is fully healed. The sheriff rarely comes this way, and no one else knows you're here. Darius shook his head. I can't ask that of you. Harboring a fugitive could land you in jail. You didn't ask. I offered. Willow stepped closer. And I'm not harboring a fugitive, I'm helping a man who defended others and is now being hunted unjustly for it. Why would you risk yourself for me? Darius asked, genuinely puzzled. You've already done more than enough. Willow's cheeks colored slightly. Perhaps I enjoy your company. It gets lonely here, and you... She hesitated. You're different from most men who pass through Emerson Creek. You listen. You think before you speak. And there's a kindness in you that you try to hide. Darius was taken aback. I'm not kind. No? She smiled. Then why did you confront that foreman on behalf of miners you barely knew? Why did you tell me about the stray dog you fed for 3 weeks in that mining camp? Why did you help me weed the garden yesterday when your side was still hurting? He had no answer for that. Stay, Willow said softly. At least until the sheriff's warning is forgotten. A week or 2 at most. Against his better judgment, Darius agreed. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of Darius's life. By day, he remained hidden in Willow's cottage, reading her books, repairing things around the house, and even learning to bake simple breads under her tutelage. By night, they would talk for hours by the fire, sharing stories, ideas, and occasional debates about everything from politics to poetry. Darius found himself opening up more than he had to anyone in years, revealing childhood memories, dreams he'd once had, disappointments he'd suffered. Willow listened without judgment, offering insights and sharing her own experiences in return. What began as gratitude for her help evolved into admiration for her independence, her intelligence, and her unwavering moral compass. And beneath that admiration, something deeper was taking root, an affection that both exhilarated and terrified him. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Willow asked a question that caught him off guard. What would you do if you weren't running? If you could build a life somewhere, what would it look like? Darius stared into the flames, considering. I never let myself think about it. Seems pointless when the next town is always calling. Try, she encouraged. Just for tonight, imagine it. He was quiet for a long moment. I'd like land of my own. Not much, just enough for a small ranch. A few horses, some cattle. A place where I made the rules and answered to no one. He glanced at her, then back to the fire. Maybe someone to share it with, though I never thought that was in the cards for me. Why not? Hard to court a woman properly when you might need to leave town at a moment's notice, he said with a wry smile. And if you didn't have to leave? Willow pressed. If you could stay? Their eyes met, and Darius felt his heart quicken. Then I suppose I'd have to learn how to court a woman properly. A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. In the flickering light, Willow looked both vulnerable and determined. I think, she said softly, that you might be better at it than you realize. Before Darius could respond, there was a pounding at the door, harsh and urgent. Miss Calloway, open up, a man's voice called. Darius was on his feet instantly, reaching for the gun he now kept hidden beneath the sofa cushion. Willow placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Let me see who it is." She approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" "Deputy Wilson, madam. Sorry to disturb you so late, but it's urgent." Willow opened the door slightly, keeping her body in the gap. "What is it, deputy?" "There's a fire at the bakery, madam. Looks like someone knocked over a lamp. The bucket brigade is trying to contain it. But you should come quickly." "My bakery?" Willow's voice rose in alarm. "I'm coming right away." She closed the door and turned to Darius, her face pale. "I have to go." "I'll come with you," he said immediately. "No, it's too dangerous. The whole town will be there." "I'm not letting you go alone," Darius insisted. "I'll stay in the shadows, but I'm coming." They hurried through the dark streets toward the town center, where an orange glow illuminated the night sky. As they got closer, Darius could see flames leaping from the roof of Willow's bakery while townspeople formed a line, passing buckets of water from the town well to the burning building. Willow rushed forward with a cry of dismay. Darius hung back in the darkness between buildings, watching as she joined the bucket line. The fire was spreading rapidly. And despite the townspeople's efforts, it was clear the bakery wouldn't be saved. As Darius observed from his hiding place, something about the scene struck him as wrong. A knocked-over lamp shouldn't have caused a fire that spread so quickly. And why would a lamp be lit in an empty bakery? His suspicions deepened when he spotted two unfamiliar men at the edge of the crowd, rough-looking types who seemed more interested in scanning the faces in the bucket line than in helping with the fire. Bounty hunters. It had to be, and the fire was a trap to draw out Willow, hoping Darius would follow. He needed to warn her, but approaching now would be walking straight into their hands. Instead, he circled around behind the buildings, coming up near the rear of the bucket line. When Willow passed a bucket to the next person, Darius reached out from the shadows and caught her arm. She whirled in surprise, relaxing only when she recognized him. "What are you doing? Someone might see you." "The fire's a trap," he said urgently. "There are bounty hunters watching. They must have found out I was staying with you." Willow's eyes widened. "How?" "Someone must have seen me or noticed you bringing extra food home. It doesn't matter now. You need to act normally. Join the line again. But when the fire is under control, don't go back to the cottage. Go to a neighbor's home, somewhere public where they can't follow." "What about you?" "I need to leave town. Tonight." His hand tightened on her arm. "I'm sorry about your bakery." "It's just a building," she said fiercely. "I'm more worried about you." "Don't be. I've been avoiding bounty hunters for months." He hesitated, then added, "I'll come back for you, when it's safe." Doubt flickered across her face. "Will you?" "Yes," Darius said with a conviction that surprised even him. "I promise." After a moment she nodded. "Be careful." He watched her return to the bucket line, then slipped away toward the cottage. He needed to retrieve his few possessions and be on his horse before the bounty hunters realized their trap hadn't worked. At the cottage, Darius quickly gathered his things, his gun belt, the little money he had, a spare shirt. He was about to leave when he paused, looking around the small home that had sheltered him these past weeks. On impulse, he took a piece of paper from Willow's desk and wrote a short note. He left it on the table where she would find it, then slipped out into the night. The bounty hunters had chosen their moment well. With most of the town focused on the fire, the streets were deserted, making it easy for Darius to reach the small stable where his horse had been recuperating alongside him. The animal nickered softly in recognition as Darius entered. He quickly saddled the horse, his mind racing ahead to plan his route. South would be safest toward the territories where law was sparser, and a man could lose himself more easily. He led the horse quietly through the back lanes of Emerson Creek, avoiding the commotion around the bakery. Just as he reached the edge of town, he heard a shout behind him. "There he is! That's Summers!" Darius swung into the saddle, urging his horse forward. Gunshots cracked through the night, but he was already galloping away, bent low over his mount's neck. The sound of hooves behind him confirmed his fears the bounty hunters were in pursuit. His horse was still weak from its own period of recovery, and Darius knew he couldn't outrun them for long. He needed another strategy. A mile outside town, the road forked, one path continuing south, the other veering east toward a forested area. Darius took the eastern fork, pushing his horse into the trees. The darkness would provide cover, and the more difficult terrain might give him an advantage over pursuers who didn't know the land. For 2 hours, Darius played a deadly game of hide-and-seek with the bounty hunters, doubling back, crossing streams to mask his trail, and using every trick he'd learned in years of evasion. Finally, when he was confident he'd lost them, he allowed his exhausted horse to slow to a walk. Dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Darius found a sheltered clearing near a small stream and made camp, allowing his horse to rest while he considered his next move. The logical choice was to keep riding south, to put as much distance as possible between himself and Emerson Creek. Yet even as he thought this, Darius knew he couldn't simply vanish from Willow's life without a backward glance. He had promised to return, and it was a promise he intended to keep. But how? The bounty hunters would be watching for him now, and returning to town would be suicide. Unless... An idea began to form in Darius's mind, risky, potentially foolhardy, but the only way he could see to both clear his name and return to Willow. The mining company foreman's brother, the judge who had put the bounty on him, was the key. If Darius could somehow prove the foreman had drawn first, that the shooting was self-defense, the charges might be dropped. There had been witnesses that day, miners who had seen the confrontation. If he could find them, convince them to testify. It was a long shot, but it offered something Darius hadn't had in months: hope. After resting for a day, Darius headed north instead of south, toward the mining town of Cottonwood Springs where it had all begun. It was dangerous, but necessary. The journey took nearly 2 weeks, during which Darius kept to back trails and camped away from towns to avoid detection. When he finally reached Cottonwood Springs, he approached cautiously, waiting until nightfall to enter the town. The miners' camp was on the outskirts, a collection of rough cabins where the men who worked the nearby silver mine lived. Darius made his way there, hoping to find someone who remembered him, someone who had witnessed the shooting. To his surprise, when he knocked on the door of the first cabin, it was opened by a man he recognized: Patrick O'Malley, an older miner who had been outspoken about the foreman's abuses. "Summers," O'Malley gasped, quickly pulling Darius inside. "Are you mad? Coming back here? The judge's men are still looking for you." "I need your help, Patrick," Darius said. "You saw what happened that day. You know I shot in self-defense." O'Malley nodded grimly. We all know it. Foreman Blackwell was a mean bastard who'd been itching to put a bullet in someone. When you confronted him about shorting our pay, he went for his gun first. Would you be willing to testify to that? Before a federal marshal, not the local judge?" O'Malley hesitated. "It'd be risky. Judge Blackwell has this town in his pocket. Anyone who speaks against his brother might find themselves in trouble." "I understand," Darius said. "But without witnesses, I'll spend the rest of my life running from bounty hunters. Or worse, end up swinging from a rope for a crime that was self-defense." The older man was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. "There's a federal marshal due in Silver City next month for the circuit court. Several of us could travel there to give statements." He gave Darius a curious look. "Why now, though? You've been on the run for months. What changed?" Darius thought of Willow, of her kindness, her strength, the life that might be possible if he could clear his name. "I found something worth stopping for," he said simply. Over the next few days, Darius worked with O'Malley to gather statements from other miners who had witnessed the shooting. 5 men were willing to testify, all respected workers with no reason to lie. Their written accounts, combined with evidence of the foreman's pattern of abuse and theft from the miners, built a compelling case for self-defense. But getting these statements to the federal marshal without being captured remained a challenge. Judge Blackwell's influence extended throughout the county, and his men were still actively searching for Darius. A plan began to form. O'Malley would travel to Silver City ahead of time, bringing the written statements and preparing the marshal for Darius's arrival. Darius would follow separately, timing his appearance to coincide with the court session when the marshal would have the authority to immediately review his case. It was risky exposing himself in a courtroom where anyone might recognize him, but it offered the best chance of officially clearing his name. And freedom from the bounty was the only way he could return to Willow without bringing danger to her door. The plan was set in motion. O'Malley departed for Silver City with the statements hidden in his luggage, while Darius waited in a remote cabin belonging to one of the sympathetic miners. As the days passed, Darius found his thoughts constantly returning to Willow. Was she safe? Had she been able to rebuild after the fire? Did she believe he would keep his promise to return? In quiet moments, he would reread the letter he'd carried with him since leaving her cottage, a response to the note he'd left her, delivered by a trusted miner who had traveled to Emerson Creek on Darius's behalf. The bakery is lost, but I am well. The townspeople have been kind, helping me begin again. I have taken a room above the dressmaker's shop while I decide what to do next. The men who set the fire left town the morning after you escaped. I believe they thought you had gone for good. I find myself looking for you in every stranger who passes through town, though I know the danger of your return. Whatever you decide, know that those days when you were here were among the happiest I've known. Be safe, be well, and if you can, be here. W. Her words gave him strength during the anxious wait, a reminder of what he was fighting for. Finally, the day came. Darius rode into Silver City early in the morning, his hat pulled low over his face. The courthouse was already busy with people arriving for the day's proceedings. O'Malley was waiting on the steps as planned. The marshals heard our case, the miner said in greeting. He's agreed to hear your testimony first thing this morning. Darius nodded, his mouth dry with apprehension. And Judge Blackwell? No sign of him. Word is he's back in Cottonwood Springs, not expecting any trouble during this court session. They entered the courthouse, Darius keeping his head down as they made their way to the marshal's chambers. Marshal James Wilson was a stern-faced man with graying hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent decades upholding the law in difficult territories. Mr. Summers, he said, looking Darius over carefully, you're taking quite a risk coming here. Yes, sir, Darius agreed, but I'm tired of running from a false charge. The marshal gestured to a stack of papers on his desk. I've reviewed the statements from these miners. If their accounts are true, you've been unjustly pursued. They're true, sir. I confronted Foreman Blackwell about cheating the miners. He drew his gun first. I shot in self-defense. And then you ran, the marshal pointed out. With the foreman's brother being the judge, I didn't expect a fair trial, Darius explained. But I never killed anyone in cold blood, and I never ran from honest justice. Marshal Wilson considered this, then nodded. Very well. I'll hear your full testimony in court today, along with that of these witnesses. If I'm convinced, I have the authority to dismiss the charges and cancel the bounty. Relief washed over Darius. Thank you, sir. The court session began an hour later. Darius testified first, recounting the events of that day in Cottonwood Springs, how he had approached Foreman Blackwell about the miners' pay, how the man had responded with threats before reaching for his gun, and how Darius had fired in self-defense. One by one, the miners corroborated his account. They described the foreman's history of abuses, the dangerous conditions in the mine, and the systematic shorting of their pay. Most importantly, they all confirmed that Blackwell had drawn first. As the last witness finished, Marshal Wilson leaned forward. Based on the evidence and testimony presented, I find that Darius Summers acted in self-defense when he shot Foreman Blackwell. The charges against him are hereby dismissed, and the bounty is canceled. A written notice to this effect will be sent to all county sheriffs in the territory. It was done. After months of running, of looking over his shoulder, Darius was a free man again. Outside the courthouse, O'Malley shook his hand firmly. "You've got your life back, Summers. What will you do with it?" Darius smiled, thinking of the promise he had made in the shadows of a burning bakery. "I'm going to keep my word to someone who believed in me when no one else would." 3 days later, Darius rode into Emerson Creek in broad daylight, a copy of the marshal's official dismissal of charges in his pocket. The town looked much as he remembered it, though the charred remains of Willow's bakery stood as a stark reminder of the night he'd fled. He made his way to the dressmaker's shop, his heart pounding with a nervousness he hadn't felt facing down bounty hunters or testifying in court. What if Willow had moved on? What if she no longer wanted him in her life? The bell above the shop door jingled as he entered. A middle-aged woman looked up from her sewing. "Good afternoon," she greeted him. "How can I help you?" "I'm looking for Miss Calloway," Darius said. "I understand she's renting a room here." The woman studied him for a moment. "And who might be asking for her?" "An old friend," Darius replied. "Darius Summers." Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes. "Wait here," she said, disappearing through a back door. Moments later, the door reopened, and Willow stood there, her eyes wide with disbelief. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and to Darius, she had never looked more beautiful. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised I would," he said, taking a step toward her. "The bounty lifted," Darius said, producing the marshal's document. "I'm a free man. No more running." Willow's eyes filled with tears as she read the paper. Then, heedless of the dressmaker's curious gaze, she crossed the room and threw her arms around him. Darius held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of flour and cinnamon that still clung to her hair despite the months away from her bakery. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that he had found his home. "I love you," he whispered against her hair, words he had never said to anyone before. "I think I started falling in love with you the moment you handed me that bread without asking my name." Willow drew back enough to look into his eyes, her own shining with happiness. "And I started falling in love with you when you finally took it. When I saw that, beneath all that suspicion and wariness, there was a man willing to accept kindness." Their lips met in a kiss that held both the sweetness of homecoming and the promise of a future together, a future Darius had never dared to imagine until Willow showed him that kindness could exist in a world he had long ago decided was cruel. 6 months later, a new bakery opened in Emerson Creek, larger and more modern than the one that had burned. "Calloway and Summers Bakery," the sign proclaimed, and from dawn until dusk, the aroma of fresh bread drew townspeople and travelers alike. Darius had used his savings, along with a small inheritance Willow had received from her aunt in Denver, to rebuild the bakery with an attached home behind it. Here, they built a life together, day by day, loaf by loaf. Each morning, Darius would rise before dawn to light the ovens, marveling at how naturally he had taken to the baker's life. There was something deeply satisfying about creating something with his hands that brought others sustenance and joy. And each evening, as they closed the shop together, he would remember that first act of kindness a loaf of bread offered without questions or judgment that had changed everything. In a land where survival often depended on suspicion and self-reliance, Willow had shown him that there was another way to live. She had given him not just bread, but a chance at redemption, at love, at a life where kindness was not a weakness, but the greatest strength of all.